This is a Bavli story about a Sukkah, a Savta, and Misogyny with Miss Meira Wolkenfeld, who has most recently taught for Risha as part of the Dr. Beth Samuel's summer high school program. And today she will be teaching about, in this class, we will analyze a Talmudic story in which a woman accuses the exilarch of sitting in a stolen sukkah. The story follows a legal discussion about performing the mitzvot of Sukkot using stolen items. Looking at the literary and cultural context, we will examine the interpersonal interactions in the story and the way the story nuances and personifies the themes of this learning discussion. And for those of you who have not had the privilege of learning with Ms. Wolkenfeld before, Ms. Wolkenfeld is a doctoral candidate at the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies at Yeshiva University. Her dissertation examines the role of the sense of smell in the world of the Babylonian Talmud. She has taught previously at Nyack College and in our own Dr. Beth Samuel's high school program. And she is also studying at Yeshivat Maharat. For those of you on Zoom, we have source sheets available in the chat shortly. For those of you watching on Facebook Live, please keep an eye on the chat. You will see source sheets coming up shortly, and I believe you'll also be sharing slides?
Yes, there is a source sheet, but you do not need the source sheet. It's if you want it. When we're looking at text, I'll share it as a slide so we're on the same page, and the source sheet is if you want to go back and forth.
All right. And and please feel free to turn off to show us your face, show us your camera. It's good to see everyone for a little bit of Gemara in the morning. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself if it's periodically if it's a good spot to ask questions. If you are watching on Facebook Live, please ask your questions in the chat. I will make sure that they get kind of passed forward. And with that, good morning.
Awesome. Thanks, Kayla. It's really nice to see everyone. I'm excited to be here. When I was asked if I had something to teach about Sukkot, I thought back to my time when I was teaching over the summer. I was giving, as Kayla mentioned, I was giving a Gemara share in the high school program, and we were actually learning Masechet Sukkah. So I thought back to our learning over the summer, and there was really one story, one text that really grabbed me. It's a provocative story, and so I think it is really enhanced by learning it in this type of context where we can hear everyone's reactions. And really the story itself is about feeling heard and feeling seen. So in that vein, I hope that however you're joining us, that you'll be able to join the conversation. When you study a story, you can hear a story just sort of in a vacuum by itself, and a story can have meaning and you can interpret a story that way. Or you can study a story in relation to the context that it's told in. And sometimes the context informs what you see in the story. And sometimes the story informs how you understand the context. And that's what I'm going to try to do today, what I hope we'll think about. One thing is how the story relates to its context. So I'm going to start just by sort of summarizing the Gemara, what the Gemara is talking about here. That'll be the first part. I'll sort of do that, sort of frontally explain what is the discussion in the Gemara that is happening when we get to this story. And aside from that contextual introduction, I'm also going to try and give some cultural context to the story. Then we're going to read the story together, and that's a point where I'll definitely share my screen and we'll read it more closely. And after we read and translate, that's a point that I want to open up for discussion and hear some of your reactions and interpretations. And then to close, I'll share some of my own reflections and research around the story. And I hope it's a good example of how the Gemara uses stories, but I hope also there'll be some message that we can bring into our own celebration of this holiday, because it's a story about Sukkot. So for the context, this story appears in the 3rd chapter of Masechet Sukkah. And if you have ever chosen your own lulav and etrog, you might have looked at its color or how many leaves it has, if it has a blemish on the skin, if the leaves are separated. The rules about all of that are found in this chapter. The Mishnah there deals with what makes a kosher lulav and an etrog. And here I'm going to share my screen, because even though the Mishnah is mostly about here what makes a kosher lulav and etrog, a lot of it is physical qualities. The Mishnah begins, lulav hagazul v'hayavesh pasul. A stolen lulav and a dried lulav, a lulav that's completely dried out, is pasul. It's completely invalid. It doesn't work as a lulav. And I think the starting place and the grouping here is intentional. as if to say, just like the dried lulav, it's never going to be kosher. Just as the physical imperfections make what works as a kosher lulav or not a kosher lulav, so too its ethical origins also inform what makes it a kosher lulav. And the Mishnah is very straightforward here. A stolen lulav is not kosher. That's the end of the story. Simple, straightforward. The stolen lulav is not a lulav. It doesn't work. And when we turn to the Gemara, when we turn to the Babylonian Talmud, as the Talmud is wont to do, the Gemara here is going to complicate the picture. The Mishnah says the stolen lulav doesn't work. That's it in the Mishnah. And the Gemara is going to sort of play with that and say, maybe there's a way that the stolen lulav actually does work. What I would say is that this whole sugya, this whole discussion is built on a contrast. The sugya is composed by putting in tension different sources. On the one hand, you have sources that, there we go. On the one hand, you have sources that support this perspective of the Mishnah that the stolen one is always not going to work. And then there's sources that are in tension with that and challenge it in various ways. So for example, in this Gemara, they have a principle which says mitzvah haba be'avera eno mitzvah. A mitzvah that comes from a sin is not a mitzvah. So we know you can't steal. This principle says not only can you not steal, but the mitzvah you're doing with the stolen lulav, that is also not a mitzvah. And this side, this voice in the Gemara is supported by verses from the prophets, like this verse from Isaiah. Ki ani Hashem ohev mishpat sona gezel ba'ola. I am God who loves justice and I hate a stolen sacrifice. It's this strong, moral, indignant language, but that is in tension with other sources that are brought that challenge this in various ways. So for example, we have here the position of Shmuel, who says, sure, you can't use the stolen lulav on the first day of the holiday, because on the first day of the holiday, there's a special rule that you need to own your own lulav. Just as an aside, that could be owning your own lulav for 5 minutes. Like, let's say I don't have a lulav, but Kayla does have a lulav. She can give me her lulav for 1 minute for me to shake it, and it'll be mine for that minute. But this is a special rule of the first day of the holiday, that there's some ownership of the arba minim on that day. So says Shmuel, yes, you can't use a stolen lulav on the first day of the holiday when you need to own your own lulav, but go ahead, it's fine. It totally works on the second day of the holiday, right? So you see there's this tension here between mitzvah haba ba'avera, the stolen lulav, like God hates the stolen lulav, versus sure, go ahead, day 2. You don't need to own your own lulav. A stolen one should be fine. And this is sort of the tension that animates the Gemara here. It talks about the stolen lulav. It talks also about hadassim that have sort of murky origins and how you can maybe use them despite the murky origins. And it plays with this in different ways. So when we get to our story, the Gemara is now talking about the stolen sukkah, and you'll see the same tension here. So we have here it's quoting a Tannaitic debate. It says, sukkah gazula, a stolen sukkah, v'hamasachich b'reshut harabim, and someone who puts up their skach in the public domain. The Gemara, we're not going to go into it, but the Gemara is going to question exactly what case we're talking about here. What is the case of a stolen sukkah is going to be complicated, but we'll just take it as face value. The stolen sukkah, Rabbi Eliezer posel. So Rabbi Eliezer says that does not work. The Chachamim machshirim, and the Chachamim say, yeah, a stolen sukkah is totally fine. It works for the mitzvah of sukkah. So like I said, what exactly is this case is going to be a question, but regardless, this debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis seems to be related to a debate they have that is brought up a few pages before in the Gemara about a borrowed sukkah, where Rabbi Eliezer says, just like you need to own your own lulav on the first day of the holiday, he thinks you also have to own your own sukkah on the first day of the holiday. And the rabbis think you don't need to own your own sukkah at all, any day of the holiday. And there's a verse cited in support of their position that says, Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yishvu b'Sukkot, that all the citizens of Israel will sit in Sukkot. And that is interpreted as meaning that we should all be able to sit in one sukkah together. So you don't need to own your sukkah. There's a communal aspect to this, the rabbis are picking up on in this verse. So they think that there's no special obligation to own your own sukkah, even on the first day of the holiday. Okay, so coming back to this debate, the Gemara has this debate about a stolen sukkah. And now it says, and this line is, here we have the narrative voice of the Gemara, sometimes called the stam, and it says, Aval gazal etzim v'sikach bahem. So, but if someone stole trees or wood and used them for skach, divrei hakol, according to everyone, ein lo ela demei etzim. According to everyone, he, and the he here is the original owner, is only entitled to the monetary value of the trees. So what this line is saying is, yes, there's a debate about if a stolen sukkah works, but if you steal, you have your own like walls and the rest of the sukkah is yours, but you steal some branches for skach, according to this anonymous narrative voice in the Gemara, everyone would agree that that is a kosher sukkah, totally fine, it works. You don't have to be, you're not obligated to give those branches back. All you're obligated to do is to compensate the person whose they were originally monetarily. So why that is the case, the Gemara doesn't say. We can infer it from Gemara's before and after, which Rashi mentions. But this line, this halacha that the skach, that when you steal skach, it should work and be a kosher sukkah, and you're only obligated to pay the money of the skach, this is the jumping off point for our story. So we can come back to the why if people are interested in that, but I think we should just go on to the story. Does that sound good? Okay. So I have to admit that when I submitted the title for this shir, I had not looked at manuscripts of this story. When you open up a Gemara, like off the shelf or in a Beit Midrash, or you open up Sefaria in the Gemara, so what you're looking at is the Vilna Shas, which is the version of the Gemara, which was printed in Vilna in the 1800s. And that's not the first printing of the Gemara, and we have earlier manuscripts and some earlier printings. And sometimes there are slight variations between these different versions. Usually they don't have a lot of, often not meaningful differences. And here I don't know that it is such a meaningful difference, but I'm mentioning it because that, I put Savta in the title, and then if you open up the manuscript, actually Savta is not in any of the other manuscripts. It's not in any of the other versions except for the Vilna Shas. And it's actually very easy to check if you're interested in this type of work. It's very easy to check manuscripts nowadays because they're all digitalized online on this website that I put here, the Friedberg Jewish Manuscript Society. They have a Bavli website called Hachi Garcinan, and it just gives you columns with all the versions side by side, and even what's different than the printed version is in red. So I just copy and pasted here so you could see. So the version in the printed version says, Hahi Savta Za'atya Zakame de Rav Nachman. There was a grandma who came in front of Rav Nachman, but every other version just says a woman. Maybe she is a grandma, maybe not, I don't know. It says, Hahi Itzata Za'ate Lakame de Rav Nachman. So there was a woman who came in front of Rav Nachman. And here I just want to pause for a second and ask, does anyone know anything about Rav Nachman? Who is Rav Nachman? I see a no, so I will share a little bit about Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is a rabbi in the Gemara. He is a student of Shmuel. He lives sort of towards the beginning of the Amoraic period, like end of the 200s, early 300s. And he is closely associated, he seems to have married into the family of the exilarch. The exilarch is the official representative of the Babylonian Jewish community to the government. So here's a little map. The Babylonian, I don't think you could see my cursor, right? Okay, so you can see. So Babylonia is this area between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the bottom oval here. And during this period that the Babylonian Talmud came together, it's ruled by the Sasanian Empire, which is a Persian empire. So the exilarch is the representative of the Jewish community to the Persian government. And again, what exactly that entails, how much power he has, that is murky. We don't really know that. But what we know about him from the Gemara is the exilarch is wealthy. He uses Persian words and sort of a Persian aristocratic feel. And Rav Nachman, who's married into this family, he also, he is in the Talmud associated, he is sort of made fun of for using Persian words. He seems to be wealthy. And both Rav Nachman and the institution of exilarchy are associated with two places. One place is Naharda, which is on, well, actually, it's sort of interesting, like the things we know about the ancient worlds and the things we don't know. There's actually some question where exactly Naharda was, the city, but it's either on the Euphrates River, or these rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, have canals. And the canals are, people travel on the canals and their trade goes on the canals, and also irrigation. And so Naharda is either on the Euphrates River or it's on this big canal called the Nahar Malka, the Royal Canal. Here's just another map. So you can see on this map, here's Naharda. And the other place that the exilarchy and Rav Nachman seem to be a lot is Mechoza. And the Nahar Malka goes between Naharda and Mechoza. And it would make sense for the exilarchy to be in Mechoza, because Mechoza is, it's like a suburb of Ctesiphon, which is the Persian, it's the winter capital of the Sasanian Empire. So here's Ctesiphon over here. Mechoza is a suburb that's like across the bridge from Ctesiphon. There's some famous rabbis like Rava who lives in Mechoza. And unlike Naharda, Mechoza has actually been excavated. And Ctesiphon, Mechoza and Ctesiphon, they're about 15 miles from Baghdad, if you want a sense of where it is today. And there is part of the Sasanian palace from Ctesiphon is still standing. Here's a picture from, I guess, just a few months ago. I just took a recent picture from Google Maps, because I feel like sometimes when you learn the Gemara, it's disconnected from the place. And here you can see, what does this look like today, Ctesiphon? It's unclear whether or not this palace would have been standing during the time of the Gemara. There's some unclarity about when this palace was built, but likely not during the period of the Amoraim, but perhaps at the close of the Gemara, this would have been standing here. But it gives you a sense of what would a Sasanian palace look like. It's today been partially reconstructed, and the reconstruction is falling apart. You can see that's why there's this blockade around it. You can see a little palm tree, just to give you set the stage of the story for the environments of Iraq at this time. So Rav Nachman and the exilarch, they're gonna be using luxury items, like here's some Sasanian glass. In stories in the Babylonian Talmud, here's a story about the Reish Galuta, that's the Aramaic term for the exilarch. And here it uses some Persian words. He has a avurnka, which is that's a Persian word for this royal banqueting pavilion. And he has it bebustane, in his fragrant garden. And there's a long historical tradition of the Persian aristocratic palace gardens. And so here, this is a Shabbat meal that the exilarch, someone is setting up for the exilarch in his floral garden. And I just put it here because I think it's interesting when we have our story, it's going to be about Rav Nachman and the Reish Galuta's Sukkah. And it feels like, this is just a regular Shabbat, and they're sitting in a this garden. So when we imagine them sitting in the Sukkah, it's going to have the trappings of Persian aristocracy in a certain sense. Here's another story about Rav Nachman, and in this story, a different rabbi from a different town, from Pumbedita, comes to visit Rav Nachman, and there's some tension in the story about Rav Nachman, where this other rabbi sort of chides him for using very Persian words. And one thing Rav Nachman offers him that he uses the Persian word for is actually an etrog, because that's another thing that, in stories about Persian kings in the Talmud, they sometimes eat citrons. It's like a Persian luxury fruit. So just kind of interesting how the Sukkot setting fits with maybe in the story has a certain Persian aristocratic feel. Okay, so let's go back to our story now that we know who Rav Nachman is. So Hahi Itata Ta'ate Lakame de Rav Nachman. So there was a woman who came in front of Rav Nachman. Amra le, she said to him, Reish Galuta, the Kulhu Rabbanan, and again in some versions it says Kulhu Rabbanan Devei Reish Galuta. So the Reish Galuta and all the rabbis of the house of the Reish Galuta, the Sukkah Gazula Yatve. They are sitting, excuse me, sir, you and the Reish Galuta and all of the rabbis sitting with you, you are sitting in a stolen sukkah. That's what she says to them. So the next two words are in red because that is in some versions and not others. So you can decide for yourself if you think this should be part of the story or not. It says, Savcha, Savcha, she cried and cried. Or you can not have that line in the story if you want. The lo eshkach ba Rav Nachman. He did not pay attention to her, or he did not look at her. Amra le. She said to him, Itata tahave le la'avuha tzlat mea v'timne sare avde savcha kamaychu v'lo ashkichitu ba. She says to him, a woman whose father had 318 slaves is crying in front of you and you don't even look at her, you don't pay her any attention? Amar lahu Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman said to them, he does not respond to her, he doesn't answer her, he just is talking to whoever was sitting with him in the sukkah, these other rabbis. So Amar lahu Rav Nachman said to them, Pi'ata hida, or in some versions it's Pi'ata hada. This one is a screamer. This one is a quarrelsome woman. Ein la ela demei etzim bilvad. And she is not entitled to anything except for the monetary value of the trees. Right? This was our halacha that we had right before the story. He says, I don't owe her anything. My sukkah is kosher. I only owe her the monetary value of the branches. So this is where I want to pause for a minute. And here's some of the questions I had on the story. But I'm going to unshare my screen. And I would like to know if anyone, how people react to the story. What does it make you feel? Do you sympathize with any of the characters? Are there details that stands out? Do you have questions about the story? What are your first reactions, or not first reactions if you've seen it before? Any thoughts?
Also, if you're watching on Facebook, please feel free to share, even if it's just in the chat box.
I think I see a hand from Evelyn.
Yes, there seems to be a tension, like a class tension, that's playing here alongside the whole legal tension, the whole legal question. There's this class tension. There's obviously a woman who's been rich before and now doesn't have her wealth. And then we have Rav Nachman, who's sitting there, in his beautiful sukkah, wealthy, and it's that tension that's playing out between the classes that seems to bother me. And he doesn't seem to be a sympathetic character because he's just ignoring her.
Right, totally not responsive. Yes, totally. There's definitely a class tension here. Why do you say that she doesn't have her wealth anymore? You say she was wealthy.
She refers to herself as she is the daughter of a man who had 318 slaves in the past.
Interesting, and it's not her own wealth, it's her father's wealth. And she's also here complaining. We don't exactly know. An interesting thing about the way the story is told is we don't know what actually happens, right? She says there's a stolen sukkah, and from his answer, we could infer the situation. It seems based on his answer that maybe someone took her branches to make the exilarch sukkah, and she's here fighting for her branches. So maybe that would also, I actually, it's really interesting. I didn't notice this, but I think you might be right. Maybe she was wealthy and now she's not. We don't exactly know. I think this is an interesting thing about the way the story is told in general. What do we know about the characters and what do we not? Like, she comes and says she has a stolen sukkah. We don't know what the situation is. Any other reactions or responses? I'm curious. So I think one reason the Gemara uses stories is the story doesn't have it's not like a law, that a law has a clear yes or no. A story is nuanced and it's about people. And I agree with you that Rav Nachman is so unsympathetic in this story. It's like painful to see this woman screaming before him and he doesn't even look at her. He doesn't respond to her or acknowledge her. But I'm curious if anyone hears Rav Nachman in a sympathetic light or can suggest a sympathetic reading to Rav Nachman. So Mom.
Just the way she approaches, so that she's maybe either hysterical or she interrupts, and so she's taken less seriously, and so it's not so much what she's asking, but maybe how she's asking it.
So again, I'm gonna argue for the reading that we're supposed to be critical of Rav Nachman in the story, but I think that there is some ambiguity, and I think that there are moments where both characters are somewhat sympathetic. Like I could imagine being in a situation where, like someone a few days ago told me a story where someone sort of harassed them or yelled at them on a street, and they said, and I just didn't engage, I didn't look or respond to them, and then they went away and it was fine. And again, I don't think that's what's happening here, but I think that you can imagine being in a situation where there's uncertainty about whether or not you should engage. Like, is this person stable? Is it better to, you don't want to not recognize someone's humanity, but I don't think Rav Nachman is right here. I think the story is being critical of him, and I'm going to try and prove that. But I think that stories are not straightforward, and maybe there is a uncertainty here. Is that in other hands, Evelyn?
I'll mute myself. And when I think about Reb Nachman, he isn't given a chance to defend himself. She's just coming at him. And you don't really know, are you supposed to believe that he intentionally is using stuff that's been stolen? I mean, if he's Reb Nachman and he has all the money in the world, why would he ever do that? Yeah. So you have to give him some means of defending himself, and she's not doing that. And the story doesn't really tell us how he comes to use this schach. Maybe it's very innocently, and he didn't know that it was stolen.
Yeah, I find that one moment in the story that I find very uncomfortable is actually the way that he responds, which is he doesn't deny that it's stolen, which makes you feel like he knows, because his answer isn't, I didn't steal it, I don't know where this stuff comes from. His answer is, oh yeah, it's stolen, but the rule is that I'm only obligated to pay for the value. I don't have to give it back. Right? That's the halakha that he quotes in the end. And now that I'm bringing up the halakha, I am curious if people have ideas about how this story relates to the context. So maybe we'll get back to that. And there's just one more piece I wanna ask you about. Any thoughts on what she says here? My father had 318 slaves or servants. What is going on with that line? Any thoughts about that? Yeah. Is that Evelyn? Are you?
I think she's just putting herself on an equal status with him. I'm just as good as you are.
Yeah.
Listen to me.
You can read it as a critique of Rav Nachman or the exilarch, as she's saying, sort of, you seem like you're only going to respond to someone who's as wealthy as you, which is what you said in the beginning about this class. There's this class conflict here. I also wondered when I first read it, it's like unclear exactly what she's saying. Maybe we're supposed to wonder, does she know what she's talking about? Is she sort of just rambling in sort of a crazy way? I think it's not clear. And Rashi has sort of an interesting suggestion here, and maybe I'm gonna share my screen again to look at some texts that might help us in our interpretation.
Can I just jump in with one or two questions from the
yes,
Zoom chat?
please.
One person in comment, I believe, maybe this is in response to the, I guess the 318 slaves, or it's like the comment saying like, he does not even look at her. And it's possible the number of slaves is like, this is a sign of her standing in the community, from JB.
Yeah, totally. And it does sound like that's what she's trying to do. Like, you're sitting here with all these high class people. Like, why don't you see me? Like, I am also from this background. Acknowledge me. Yeah, totally think that's what is happening.
All right.
Okay, oh wait, I see some hands here. Mom, do you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say there might be a little bit of irony there, though, because at some level she's sort of complaining like status or wealth shouldn't be relevant, but nonetheless, for me to enter the conversation, I'm going to prove that I have it.
Yeah.
You know, like, I don't know, you could kind of argue that both ways.
Yeah, I want to come back to that. I'm going to come to that in a minute. Evelyn, did you want to say something again as well? No, okay. Yeah, so that what you said is interesting. And here, let me share my screen again. I'm gonna go forward and then back here. Rashi has an interesting suggestion here about these 318 servants, and we can take it or leave it. But what Rashi says is, he says, I recognize that number 318, is that he thinks that's a reference to Abraham, because there is this story, I put it here, where Abraham goes to war to protect, right, Lot's been captured and Abraham goes to war, and he has 318 people who are members of his household that he's bringing with him. So Rashi says this 318 is a reference to Abraham, and if so, then you could read it kind of what you're pointing to. It's interesting, like it's a story about, like there's this discrepancy of privilege, and she's not saying like, listen to me, I'm poor. She's saying, listen to me, I'm also rich. If you read this in Rashi's way, that this is a reference to Abraham, you don't have to say that, because you could read it as she's saying, look, my father is Abraham. We're all Jewish. I am also need to be heard. So that is one reading of that 318. And again, it's an open question. Is that a reference to Abraham or not? I don't know. And if it is a reference to Abraham, it's sort of an interesting reference. Like, it feels kind of almost random. I don't know if I don't know why. Why is that the reference? Yes, Evelyn. Yeah.
I have no basis for it, but it seems to me we're coming into the middle of a discussion, and there was something prior that we don't know about. Like here, she's coming in screaming, but something must have happened before that. She may have tried to get her compensation earlier or tried to get heard earlier. Something is missing.
I agree with you.
Just...
Yes. I feel that from Rav Nachman's response, what he is implying in his response is this woman has and again, I don't know if it's justified because we don't know. We're told so little in this story. All we're told is what they say and how they respond. But the way he says she's a screamer, she's a quarrelsome woman, that word pi'ata, it means she's a quarrelsome woman. It's, to me, he seems to be implying that they have some kind of history. Like, this is a person who comes to yell at him a lot. Again, we don't know if it's true, but I think that's what he's saying. that it's sort of in the middle of that somehow. And it's interesting to me, one thing I really love about Gemara stories is you don't, if you've read a Gemara story, you may not expect them to, but a short story about a rabbi, you might think it would be like an example, and that it's gonna tell you something about how this rabbi acted in such a great way. And the stories in the Gemara are not like that. The rabbis are fallible and human and flawed. And I think this is an example of that type of story. But it's interesting because there are other stories about Rav Nachman when usually he is in this type of story. So the language of that she comes before Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman is a judge, and that language is sort of like the language of you come before a judge with a complaint. And there are stories of cases of people coming before Rav Nachman. Usually they're stories about him actually being sympathetic, of him hearing the orphan or listening to the woman. When I thought this was specifically a story about a Savta, I looked at other stories that use the word Savta, which could be implying like an older woman. And I thought maybe there's some sort of stereotype there, but they're not. Like, he's actually a person who's particularly sympathetic in other stories, which I don't know if that makes it, like, in one way that could mean like we should interpret this as he's justified in responding to her. But on the other hand, I think you could read that as it's almost worse. Like, here's a person who thinks that they're responsive, who thinks that they're sympathetic, and even they're messing up and not seeing that they're not seeing someone. I'm going to go to some of those other stories. And we shouldn't assume that every story knows every other story, or that these are working off of each other, but it's just interesting to see how does the Gemara value, how does it think of Rav Nachman? What other types of stories are taught about it, and how does it relate to like these themes of not looking at her? This phrase, not paying attention to her, does come up in other stories. So we're just going to look at these ones briefly. This one says, a person who built a padna. If anyone knows about ancient architecture, that's it's a mansion, but it's a Akkadian word that I think it is in English also, apadana. Whatever, this guy built a mansion on the garbage heap that belongs to orphans. And Rav Nachman confiscates the person's mansion. And there is a rule, the Gemara discusses this in the context of whether or not, a garbage heap is not a property that anyone is living on, or I guess they're using it for their garbage, but it seems like not in this case. And the Gemara is trying to figure out whether or not if you squat in a place that's uninhabited, do you have to pay rent or not? And it's sort of assuming at this point that you wouldn't have to. So it says, well, does Rav Nachman think you have to pay? Like, this guy who, he's building something on this land that isn't really being used for anything, but then Rav Nachman confiscates it from him. And the Gemara says, no, he doesn't think that, but it's just that these orphans were getting someone of this tribe, these nomadic people, the Carmanians, were living on this land, and they were giving the orphans some money to live here. And now that they're not, Rav Nachman said to this new person who's going to build on this garbage heap that he needs to pay the orphans. So this is a story specifically with Rav Nachman, where it says, here it's the other person who, velo eshkach, that was our phrase, right, Rav Nachman, that was repeated in our story, that this woman has a complaint, velo eshkach bar Rav Nachman, he doesn't pay attention to her. So here's someone else who doesn't pay attention to the plight of orphans, and Rav Nachman confiscates his mansion. So this is a story like where the rabbi is good, is being evaluated positively, and he is listening to the plight of the orphans, and he is like, the listening thing is clearly something that you want to do in this case. Here's another one. This one I got from a very lovely article from someone named Shmuel Faust, who has a book on Agadita where he talks about our story. And he says that on face value, you might think originally that our story is go back for a second. I'm going to unshare my screen and then come back to this. So in terms of how we see the story as relating to the context, on the face value, I think on the most surface reading, it seems like on the surface level reading, the story supports the most only surface level reading, the story supports the context where the Gemara said this rule, everyone agrees that if you steal skach, you only have to pay the monetary value and it is a kosher sukkah. And then the Gemara tells a story which shows here's a rabbi, here's this big rabbi who repeats that ruling. So on a very surface level, it's supporting the halacha with a story. But many people have written about how oftentimes stories on that surface level they support, but really they are nuancing and complicating and subverting. And in Shmuel Faust's article, he suggests that that's what's happening here, and I think this is right. On the surface level, the Gemara, the Rav Nachman, yes, Rav Nachman is supporting the halacha in the story. But firstly, the Gemara said, everyone agrees that if you stole the skach, this sukkah works and you only are obligated in the money. Well, when you get to the story, not everyone agrees because this woman, this happens to her and she's mad, right? So she's clearly not everyone agrees because here she is up in arms. But I think even more than that, the story is making us think, okay, here's the halacha, but it is uncomfortable and it's not so nice. And what Faust says is that this relates to the larger theme of the sugya when I spoke before about the context and these two things that are putting in contrast here, the stolen, this moral, indignant moral voice of the stolen lulav is always a problem, and mitzvah baba vera, a mitzvah that is dependent upon a sin is always a problem, versus the halachic positions that are suggesting, oh, maybe there's a way to use the stolen one, right? That was the major tension in the sugya. And the story personifies that tension in these two characters. You have the woman who is the voice of indignant, moral, uncompromising moral voice. And you have the rabbi who is the legal position. And so it subverts a little bit the halacha and the Gemara in that it makes us think maybe that's the halacha, but look at this woman, like that wasn't so nice. And look at Rav Nachman, he's the halachic voice, but he's so uncomfortable in this story, and so it personifies those characters that way. There's a very famous Ramban where the Ramban uses the phrase naval b'reshut haTorah, someone who is disgusting with the permission of the Torah. Right, you did something that was like halachically permissible, but it's just not nice. And I think this story is making us feel like that, like maybe there's a halachic permissibility that is still inappropriate, and that's actually the question of the sugya: is the halacha always going to be with what is totally like the most yashar, or is it more, is there going to be a way to use this lulav that came from this, or this sukkah that has something unsavory in its past? And the story personifies those two different positions. Okay, so now with that, going back to the story of Rav Nachman, this other story of Rav Nachman, because this is one story that Shmuel Faust points to say, we are supposed to read Rav Nachman here in a negative light. This is a story not actually about Rav Nachman, but here it's a story about, I'm going to just go from right before the blue. I just highlighted, you can see how this story is related to our story. It uses very similar phrases, and I'm not sure exactly how they're related, but there's certainly some connection here. So here's a story where Rav Yehuda have a yativ kameh to Shmuel. So Rav Yehuda is sitting in front of Shmuel. Shmuel is a Amora from the first generation, so he's actually a teacher of Rav Nachman. So Rav Yehuda just happens to be sitting there, and again, this language of yativ kameh, like there's a lot of resonances with our story. Ate hahi itata kasavcha kameh. came that woman who was crying before him. This time we don't know what her complaint is. We don't know if it's the same woman. I mean, this is set in an earlier time, but here's a woman coming and complaining in front of Shmuel. And it's just interesting how it uses exactly the same language of our story. I meant to say earlier, we talked about the class tension in our story, but of course there's also a gender tension, right? Here's this woman, she's standing and she comes to this sukkah where it's full of rabbis who are sitting. And there is a gendered piece here. And the way that he refers to her as Savta, so there are other stories, as I mentioned, there are stories of women coming and bringing their complaints before the court, before Rav Nachman, and often there's stories about him listening to women and being sympathetic, which obviously this is not. But that word Savta is commonly used for a woman complaining. And actually, let's go back and look at it in the story. Right, so there's this thing in some versions and not others that says she complained and she cried and cried, Savcha, Savcha. But that's not, one thing Faust points out is that's not actually the original word the Gemara used to characterize the way she talks. The Gemara says, she said to him, Amra le, she says to him, you're sitting in a stolen sukkah. And what Faust suggests is Savcha. Savcha is how he sees her. He sees her as crying and crying. And just interesting about this word, so this is a word that is used specifically for, it's not used for men who come and bring a case to a court. It's only used for women who are coming to bring a case to a court. So I think there is such a big, and I, when I hear this story, I think it is so, one thing that is shocking about it is it feels so contemporary, like so much part of contemporary discourse, like shockingly so about, here is a story about a woman not being heard. I saw that there's a word someone coins in 2017 called heapete instead of repeat. A heapete is when a woman says an idea and no one listens to it, and then a man repeats it and everyone says, this is such a great idea. I think that this is something that people I know feel that they encounter professionally sometimes. And I think this is something, like you feel it in the story. She's talking and he doesn't listen. And I thought, am I reading this with too modern of a lens? But I think that this is actually, the story is critiquing Rav Nachman for this. So the word Savcha, as I said, it's used for women. And I think that's a little bit where we see some of this story is not critiquing the use of that word, but I think Savcha is like shrill, the word shrill in English. I don't think people use the word shrill to describe men. Right, shrill is specifically a critique of women. I don't know that Savcha has the same, I don't know that it has the same, like, it brings with it the same things, but I think here it's a word like this woman is a screamer. It's using a certain stereotype of a woman who's screaming and complaining, like sort of a mad woman. And I think this is how Rav Nachman sees her, and yet the story is critiquing this. And here, just this is the other story that Shmuel Faust points to that I think is interesting in this regard, because here, again, you have the same language of a woman who comes in front of Shmuel and she is doing this complaining, crying. V'lo have mashkach be. And just like Rav Nachman, he does not pay attention to her. Okay, but here this story is more explicit about how we should think about that not paying attention, because Amar le, Rav Yehuda's here sitting and observing, and he says to Shmuel, Lo sava lemar, atem ozno mizak kadzal, gam hu yikra v'lo yaneh. Rav Yehuda says to Shmuel, don't you hold like this verse? Like this is a verse in Proverbs. The one who cries out, if you don't listen, if you withhold your ear from the one who's crying out, you too will call out and not be answered. Right? That's a pretty strong critique. You're withholding your listening from someone crying out, you also won't be listened to. That's pretty clear that what he's doing is wrong. And Shmuel sort of replies in this ambiguous way, not ambiguous, but not super great way. He's like, yeah, he says this unusual thing here. Your head is in cold water. There's a typo here, but the head of your head is in hot water, which presumably means something like, yes, I should be punished. Like, yes, it was wrong for me not to listen, but it's especially wrong for the person who's even above me. Like, the real head is the one who the most needs to listen, which I think is interesting in our story, because where this story appears about Shmuel and Rav Yehuda is a discussion of the exilarch and the exilarch's responsibilities to the people. And the point here is sort of like, a regular person should listen, but someone who's really in charge, all the more so they should listen. And I think this is interesting in our reading of Rav Nachman. He's the top guy in the story. So how should he especially respond? And again, I don't know what the right words are. And it depends on if you think the woman is she right or is she not right? But how should he respond? And certainly the story is saying the not listening is not a good thing. So I do think we're supposed to read our story as critical to Rav Nachman. Gonna unshare again, just to see the time. So again, we've considered the story in relation to the Sugya and how it relates to the Sugya and sort of nuances it and adds a critique. But we can also think about the story on its own. And this is a story about Sukkot. So I just want to end by thinking about, why is the story set on Sukkot? Does it draw on the themes of the Sukkah? How does it relate to Sukkot? And I was thinking, when I hear this story about, if the 318 is indeed a reference to Abraham, this is a story about a sukkah. To me, the reference that I hear is a reference, not that I hear, that I wonder if there's a resonance to Abraham's tent, because we're talking about a sukkah, and what's the structure that's with Abraham, his tent? Abraham is, of course, known for hospitality, and the source is the Midrash. There's a verse after Abraham has a Brit Milah, and he's sitting Petach HaOhel, he's sitting in the opening of his tent. And the Midrash says he's sitting at the opening of his tent because he wants to see who's going to come. He's purposely making it open to see who's passing. And that's where he runs out to see, he sees these three people walking who are the three angels, but he doesn't know who they are. And he runs out to greet them. And it's so in contrast to Rav Nachman, because our story is Rav Nachman sitting in a sukkah with his friends, with the other rich rabbis. And a woman comes and he doesn't listen to her and pay attention to her. And that is so in contrast with the vision of Abraham sitting at his tent, who's running out to people who he has no idea who they are. Like, he just sees these people outside, he has no idea. And if it is indeed a reference to Abraham, it could be incisive in that way. I think that it's maybe one way of looking at a sukkah and what should a sukkah be like. Like, I think the story is asking us to think about who is in our sukkah and are we hearing them? Here's Rav Nachman, someone who does sometimes hear or wants to hear the voices of the poor or of women, and he's not. So who are we not listening to or not hearing? How do we make our Sukkot open in that way? How do we make them like Abraham's tents? And earlier in the shir, I mentioned the debate about whether or not you can sit in a borrowed sukkah, which is, of course, related to this question of whether or not you could sit in a stolen sukkah, right? And the Gemara says there that the rabbis think you can sit in a borrowed sukkah because of this verse that says, "Kol ha'ezrach tishvu yishvu b'Sukkot," that everyone, all the citizens are going to sit in Sukkot. There's this idea that we should all be able to sit in each other's sukkahs. And I think the story is asking us is, it's challenging us to, how do we make our sukkah a place that's open in that way, that is a place where everyone can sit with us in the sukkah. I did put on the source sheet and on the slides, I'll just show you quickly some of these sources about Avraham, because I was wondering, is there anything else that connects Avraham's tent to the sukkah? Here's a Gemara about Avraham, and in this story of Avraham and the three guests, he runs out to meet them. He prepares them all this food, and the Gemara here says all the things that Avraham did, God does something corresponding to us. So Avraham he gives these people milk and butter, so Hashem gives us the man. Or he stands with them under the tree, he stands with them, and therefore God gives us the Ananei HaKavod, the clouds of glory, which are also representative of the sukkah. So I was thinking about the sukkah as this representation of hospitality. Like, how do we make our sukkahs like those clouds of glory, those protective things? And maybe that is the reference to Abraham with the 318. Maybe that's a time that he is going out to protect someone of his household. But I just think it's an interesting, again, we don't have to take the 318 as a reference to Abraham, but I was wondering if we do, maybe there's a critique there and a suggestion that we should make our Sukkot open in that way. Someone just asked if there's a source sheet. There is a source sheet, and it is in the chat, and maybe Kayla will send it again. I think it's accessible on Drisha. Thank you.
Yes, it's available in the chat, and it will be up on drisha.org/live momentarily.
But I'd love if anyone has any other suggestions or interpretations or questions. Now would be a great time. I did want to say also how I think this is the way that a story can be subverting the halakha. This is something that has been suggested in various ways, and like in relation to other stories, that this is like a common phenomenon. And one way I saw Ruth Calderon, who has like a lovely book on stories. She characterizes it like you can pet a pet alongside the way their fur goes, or you can pet it against the fur. And when you pet it against the fur, right, it's like you read the story against the grain of the rest of the text. Sometimes it's more, you can get more out of it, which I thought was an interesting metaphor. I see a question: do we know what they would have used for skach? I do not know the answer to that, but I can tell you, we saw in the picture, there's a palm tree. They're in Iraq. There's palm trees and there's reeds. Those are the things that are around. So I don't know for sure, but that's what I would imagine. Yes, this is right. So one thing that we mentioned I'm just gonna answer this question. Someone put in the chat, do you think the original takanat Merish is a subversion also? So I didn't explain when we saw it in the Gemara, why is it that the Gemara thinks that, I'm just giving some background to this question, why is it that the Gemara thinks that you're not obligated to repay, to give her back the branches, and those become yours and it's a kosher sukkah and you're only obligated to pay the money? So the Gemara doesn't say why, but there's really two possibilities mentioned in Rashi. One of them is that there's a rule, like let's say you stole a chunk of clay and you made your chunk of clay into a bowl. So let's say I stole some clay from Kayla and made my clay into a bowl. I don't have to give Kayla back the bowl. That's not what I stole. Because that has had a shinui masa and shinui shem, I've changed the object so much that it's a new object. I didn't steal a bowl from Kayla. I stole clay from Kayla. So I become the owner of the bowl that I made, and I'm only obligated to give her back the money. So that's one possibility of why you don't have to give back the skach. Maybe you stole some tree branches, but you are the one who made it into skach, and now it's a new thing. The other possibility is that this is part of takanat merish, which is also called takanat hashavim. So the rule of the beam or the rule of the penitence. And this is a rule that states, if I stole a beam and I built it into a house, I stole a giant beam and I built it into a house. So technically this beam does not belong to me and I should have to give it back to the person I stole it from. But the halacha is that I don't have to. That beam becomes mine and I only pay back the money because we don't want, this is why it's called takanat hashavim, we don't want to make such a strong impediment to my repentance. Like if I have to undo my entire house, I'm not going to want to do that. That's going to be a huge barrier to me doing tshuva. So we say, okay, fine, you can leave your house up and you'll just pay back the money of the beam. That's takanat merish. And so that's also could be what's happening here in the story or in this halacha, that we don't want to say you should have to return it. You would have had to return it, except that we don't want to have to say that. We don't want to create this barrier to your doing tshuva. You built this into your sukkah. It's your skach now. We're just going to let you have it and you'll pay back the money. So I think that the story can be read. I don't know if this is exactly what you're asking, but I think the story is the way that it sort of can be read as subverting or sort of against the grain of the halachic portions of this Gemara. I think you can read it also as doing the same thing to takanat merish, because it's showing us the other side of, here's this woman who, like, really that is her trees. So is it fair? Who is it? It's a rule that's trying to it's trying to help the person who stole achieve tshuva and to not make too harsh a punishment, which is obviously very valuable. But the story, I do think, challenges that a little bit, or at least challenges us and makes us want to see the other side, and that like situations are complicated, and that's taking something away from the woman, because here's this woman who, like, those were her trees that she really wants. And just to go back to the way, to restate the way that this, I think, sort of is in tension with the halachic portions in a way. I like the way Faust said it, which is that there is a halacha, and this is like the halacha, but there is also an agadah, right? Agadah is a word for a story in the Gemara. And the halacha is that you don't have to pay her, you don't have to return the skach, and you just give her the money. But the halacha is, but the agadah is, this extra halachic, the situation is more complicated, and maybe that's actually not so nice. I don't know if that answered your question, Phil, but if not, let us know. And if there's any other questions, it's been so lovely to learn with you all.
It's been lovely to hear you teach as well. I don't see any other, I had a nice comment on the use of, what was it? Nice comment on the use of his spleen, but I believe that wraps up. There's no other lingering questions on Facebook Live, Pete. But it's been a joy to hear you teach, and thank you to Meira Wolkenfeld for a great class, and to everyone who is joining us today on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and on Facebook. Thank you for coming to learn. We are going to continue our Sukkot programming today very soon at 12 p.m. with Bishul Mechitza, a Sukkot invention, a alumni Beit Midrash of the Dr. Beth Samuels High School Summer Program with Leah Sarna. Please note this class will not be live streamed. This will only be on Zoom, so you have to register. And also exciting, we will resume our Fall Zman starting next Sunday, October 3rd, with Rabbi Silber and the Struggles of Jacob, a continuation of his Sunday morning Tanakh classes.
Thank you all. Thanks for joining.
And as always, you can find more information about this class and all of our upcoming fall programming on our website at drisha.org/classes. And thank you to Meira for this opportunity to learn with you. And for everyone who attended, we hope to see you again soon.